What's up, YouTube? We're going to talk essential metal today. Skid Row's second record, Slave to the Grind. What's so great about this one is that this exact video has probably existed in my head in some form since I was literally 13 years old. This is a record that I not only grew up loving, but it's a record that remains an important listen as one of those definitive records that sits right on that hard rock and metal precipice. Because I've always thought of Skid Row as a hard rock band, but then again, I'm looking at their music through my 21st century lens, where nowadays with rock and metal, there's a much more clear and distinct line in the sand. But you gotta remember that back then, when this record came out in 1991, this album's sound wasn't that far removed from the record that Pantera were touring on at the time, which was Cowboys from Hell. And nobody has ever disputed that that's a metal record. And couple that with the fact that many people cite this record as the first metal record to top the Billboard charts, and now we have an album that's classifiably metal. So I'm sure many of you watching this are well aware of the context here, but just in case. So Skid Row dropped their 1989 self-titled debut, and it becomes a huge smash with rock anthems like Youth Gone Wild, and of course the most famous song, the ballad I Remember You, and Pretty Boy frontman Sebastian Bach becomes a sex symbol, yada yada yada. But then they follow up that commercial giant with this, with Slave to the Grind, which is not more of the same accessible hair metal really, but suddenly their sound had basically transformed into a full-on metal sound. The riffs are way meaner, way more muscular. Sebastian Bach's vocals are a lot less croony and more in your face and sort of tough guy posturing. The lyrics are no longer about like banging girls on the subway, but they're a lot more gritty and confrontational. Not only did this change result in a much better album and a lot more respect for metalheads, but Slave to the Grind has kind of become like the shorthand for any time a successful mainstream band goes heavier the next round, which unfortunately is pretty rare. Like off the top of my head, Slipknot, I guess you could say on a small level, did that with Iowa being a lot heavier than their self-titled debut. Of course, you could say Pantera with Vulgar Display. It's a very short list when it comes to bands that make a big mainstream splash and then just go balls out on round two. And that's probably why people love this album so much, because it's such a rare thing to happen. But you can tell, though, that Skid Row were conscious of the change that they were making, like even down to their presentation. Take a look at these headshots. These are a lot more rugged and just a lot more edgy than the headshots that were on their debut, which unfortunately this CD right here doesn't really have a good one, but just look it up on the internet. Watch the video for I Remember You, and you'll see kind of the conscious image change happen. But of course I should mention that even this record wasn't heavy enough for Skid Row, because they would follow it up in 1995 with a record called Subhuman Race, which was even heavier than this one. It was a commercial flop, but it was a lot heavier. It was darker at times, it was punkier at times. It had a bit of a grunge influence, but obviously not enough of a grunge influence because it flopped. But we're here to talk about Slave to the Grind, which I am still so in awe of, because it proves that you can make rock music that's both commercially viable and still uncompromising, which are two terms that, if they weren't back then, have now basically become mutually exclusive to a lot of people. But these tunes, as hooky and as memorable as they are just still so mean. Just the way this record kicks off still blows my mind now as much as it did in middle school when I first heard it. Just the intro to Monkey Business, it has this unassuming, bluesy sort of fake out, and then Sebastian Bach just lets out this hair-raising scream, which has to rank among the top 10 hard rock or metal screams ever. I mean, right up there with the one in Slayer's Angel of Death, or Judas Priest Victim of Changes, or Deep Purple Child in Time, which I know these three references are very different, but what they all have in common is just a huge scream that makes you so charged up that your hair stands up. And underneath that scream is just a fucking monster headbanger of a riff. And somehow the energy stays at this high level for the entire track, save for that brief little come down in the bridge section. But this song just epitomizes that explosive energy that you look for in rock music. It's got everything. The riffs, the pounding rhythm section, the hook complete with call and response gang vocals at the end there, and then possibly the biggest X factor, which is Sebastian Bach's never-ending, larger-than-life charisma as a frontman. Believe me, these days I'm as sick of hearing about fucking Sebastian Bach as everyone else. I'm so tired of his endless self-congratulatory talk in the press about how great he was 25 years ago. But the truth is that Skid Row were Skid Row partly because Sebastian Bach just committed to being this bombastic frontman in the way that David Lee Roth did. The only difference is that, unlike David Lee Roth, Sebastian Bach had actual incredible vocal talent, whereas Roth uses personality a bit to compensate. But Skid Row got the best of both worlds with Bach as a frontman. They got the singer and the frontman. Anyway, after Monkey Business, you have the most iconic song on the album, which is the title track, with this main riff that just growls and sneers at you. I love the way that Scotty Hill and Snake Sabo slide into that first note, which is goofy when I do it like that, but it's something that I still rip off every single day as a guitar player, just the way they slide into a note to just make it that much more aggressive. And even though I've never quite understood exactly what Sebastian Bach is talking about in these lyrics, I've always just taken the phrase as a whole as general inspiration to try and put yourself out there and escape from the grind, from that assembly line that the rest of the world is stuck in, being cogs in the machine, which to me completely embodies the spirit of metal and the spirit of rock and roll, that idea. And that's partly why this song is just permanently woven into the fabric of the genre. Then we have track 3, The Threat, which is another favorite of mine. With the leading riff in this song, the band capture what I think is one of the coolest things that you can pull off as a rock band in the studio. Notice how both guitarists play this riff slightly different. One guitar plays that squealing pinch harmonic, and one doesn't, which creates the effect of like a completely live feel, as if it's just two guitarists jamming in a room. And the fact that they're both playing maybe slightly different things or picking with a slightly different attack makes it sound like it's literally coming off a stage, like it's a live record or something. It's incredible. Just for the sake of reference, the pinnacle of that to me is Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction. You can hear that Izzy and Slash are basically playing totally different things and just jamming to the feel of the song. And that's not to say that I don't love a tightly polished two guitar in unison sound, but it's a cool thing when you can pull it off, and Slave to the Grind has it, especially on The Threat. On The Threat, I also love how the gang vocals are mixed in the chorus, because you can clearly hear Bach over them. It's not like he's being blended in like a lot of gang vocals in hardcore punk, for example. So it almost sounds like there's this one guy who's leading a crowd of people, a crowd of threats to society. And one last thing about this song, which is oddly specific, but I love the way he says threat at the last chorus, at the 3-minute and 27-second mark. It's like the ultimate tough guy delivery, and I wish he used that inflection more often on this album, actually. But in terms of the riff gold medal on this album, it has to go to the opening riff on the song Psycho Love. Oh my god. This is just a clinic in riff writing. It has so much movement to it, and it's so hummable, and it so implies a groove on its own that when the drums actually kick in, it has twice the power and twice the octane behind it. And Psycho Love is a knockout all the way through too, whether it be the clean guitars in the bridge with Bach's dramatic vocals on top of them, or the solo, which is probably the most shredding solo on the album, or its smaller details like the China cymbal in the chorus, which adds just a little bit of heaviness, just a little extra layer of heaviness. Or maybe it's that key change in the second half of the verses where Rachel Bolan's bass just pokes beautifully through the spaces in the guitars. It's subtle, but it adds a lot when you really listen, especially with the bass turned up on his speaker system. I also got to shout out Mudkicker for being another banger of a riff. And I think the song Riot Act is an important one to mention too, because it sticks out a bit in the track list. It's almost like the band's ode to punk, with these openly strummed guitars just cycling through the same few power chords. And I guess the lyrics on this one too are a little more straightforward and a little more pointed. And this song, I think, adds a bit of variety to the track list and rounds it out nicely. Which of course brings us to the ballads. Skid Row did essentially get famous on a somewhat corny hair metal ballad, and on this one they bring 3 ballads to the table. Which, I think that 3 ballads is the perfect number for a 12-track album in this style. It's not what I call ballad syndrome when like half the songs feel slow, but it gives you 3 shots at that hit ballad. But B, The ballads on this one are appropriately more grim. They fit the record. They're not about chicks or summer nights or whatever, thank God. Especially the closer, Wasted Time, which is one of my personal favorite ballads ever. You have this shimmering guitar tone at the beginning, which is very 80s, but the arpeggiated chords themselves are full of this shadowy sense of unease and uncertainty. And you have lyrics like, "The horse stampedes and rages in the name of desperation." The lyrics on this song in general just really hit home for me, this concept of wasted time. One of the lyrics I like, "Can you live with yourself when you think of what you left behind?" This concept of the looming presence of regret. It's personally an anxiety that I live with every day. Like, I think to myself, am I just wasting this short time that I have on earth here? Am I doing things now that in a few years I'm going to look back on as just precious time wasted? That's not a good feeling. And like I mentioned, just cheesy, pussy-baiting love ballads dominated the late 80s. And I just love how with Wasted Time and In a Darkened Room and Quicksand Jesus, Skid Row just totally eschew that here, which thank God, because that would have ruined this album. I should also mention before I wrap up here that there's technically two versions of this record. I guess Atlantic Records were a bunch of pussies and decided to release like a clean version of the album where track 6 is a song called Beggar's Day instead of the original, which is a song called Get the Fuck Out, which I'm actually really glad they did because I own the clean version, whatever that means, and Beggar's Day, for my money, is a better song. That concept of like an album's clean version involving the complete replacement of an entire song instead of just censoring it is so interesting to me. Like, they did it on the Eminem album, the Marshall Mathers LP, but that's a little different because the song in question was Kim, where he's literally murdering his wife and describing it in graphic detail. I guess the 90s were just a bit more conservative about shit like this. But yeah, if you haven't heard this record, give it a listen. Even if you're more of like an extreme metal guy who doesn't necessarily see the appeal of music like this because it doesn't have as much oomph or as much as 300 beat per minute blast beats do. But I think you'll be surprised by how amped this album gets you between Sebastian Bach's screeching over the top vocals and just all these great riffs one after another, and just the context of the album and how they went from being a hair metal band to this, even though it's not that big of a leap, because if you listen to that first record, it's not like Winger status. It does have some grit to it and some riffs, but just this jump was so unexpected and is still so celebrated over 25 years later because, like I said, it's a rare thing. So this album is to be cherished. As always, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe, leave a comment, or shoot me a message so we can continue to talk music, and I'll see you guys soon.